Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of George Mason University and Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, find other episodes, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is April 6, 2001, and my guest is the irrepressible Michael Munger of Duke University. Mike, welcome back to EconTalk.
It's a pleasure to be on.
I know this is a relief to a lot of our listeners who keep bugging me. Where is Mike Munger? So we're really glad to have you back.
Well, I'm glad to be back, and in fairness to Russ and the listeners, I've had a series of eye surgeries that have prevented this. It wasn't that Russ didn't try, so it's my fault.
It's not totally true. We did schedule one that we executed, and I managed to destroy the file through that's happened about twice now in the 250 episodes. So, Mike, you're too kind.
I feel important. I don't think you actually do a rehearsal with most people.
That's true. That's true. Congratulations. So what we're going to talk about today is microfinance, which is a very broad term. So first, let's talk about what is under that umbrella and the range of activities that fall under the name of microfinance, and then we'll narrow it down a little bit.
Well, what I, in thinking about this, tried to start out with was what sort of things do we mean by finance? So if you think of the kind of financial intermediaries that any advanced nation have, things that we just take for granted are a savings account, place that I can put savings and have it be safe and maybe earn a small amount of interest, checking or some way of doing payment transfers so that I don't have to pay everything in cash, some way of getting credit or loans, and insurance of various kinds. And we take all of those things for granted, even to the extent of having a credit card that, if it's a debit card, actually is all of those things. It's a way of paying, it's a way of getting credit, and it's a way of drawing off my savings account. It's pretty remarkable that we take that for granted. Now, that doesn't exist in a lot of nations. They don't have financial intermediaries. And that's actually we think of as a market failure in the West. We call it disintermediation. Disintermediation is when the financial intermediaries are not there. And what bankers do in some ways is they pool together savings that a number of people have and are willing to give to the bank because maybe it's safer than burying it in the yard. And the banks take that money and then they loan it to someone else, and the difference between what they pay on savings and what they take in from the loans is how they make their profits. They also have a bunch of other fees. Well, these developing nations are completely disintermediated. They have some savings services, but the banks you can't really trust. Payment transfers are almost impossible. They have to pay in cash. And the credit services are very attenuated. There may be Johnny down by the light post in the center of town, but he employs a bunch of thugs and charges 200% interest per year. So I don't have many choices when it comes to financial intermediation. So what's meant by microfinance generally is a bewildering array of different ways of trying to provide financial intermediation. I tried to make a list. I quit at 20. There's at least 20 different kinds of microfinance. Many of them are ways of giving loans. Some of them are ways of helping people have opportunities to save, and some of them are ways to make it faster to do payment transfers. Interestingly, the new kind of work on being able to pay with your cell phone may kind of jump us ahead of all of this. You may be able to have to save and to do payment transfers with cell phones in 10 years. But in the meantime, mostly what microfinance is a way of providing, and in some cases subsidizing by outside people. We're worried that poor people in developing nations don't have access. So we provide either subsidies or the services themselves to help them get savings, checking, and credit.
So this harkens back somewhat to our earlier podcast on middlemen, where something comes between the two transactors to make it easier. If it didn't make it easier, you just go directly to the person who'd lend you the money. So banks to exist in the West, as you point out, in developed and rich countries, banks in the West have to provide something of value, a higher rate of interest or a lower rate of interest, depending whether you're a borrower or lender.
And security.
A big building with lots of guards and a big, thick safe, which is safer than yours. Of course, works the opposite way. Willie Sutton. A slight brain cramp there. A Malarian brain cramp. Willie Sutton said he robbed banks because that's where the money is. Obviously, accumulating it all in one place makes it more attractive than any one individual's backyard or mattress. But the bottom line is that in poor countries, people don't have access to these services often, and the micro and microfinance is a reference to the fact that it's not a lot of money we're talking about, especially when we're discussing a loan or a savings account. These are very small amounts of money by rich country standards, right?
Yeah, it's partly that it's a small amount of money, and it's partly that it's done at a very local level. There's no branches of some kind of central bank. It's all idiosyncratic.
Typically.
I, as a borrower, maybe I know someone or a group of us get together and form a short-term kind of, it's not a corporation, but an organization, a cooperative organization where we agree to help each other.
And that help could be insurance, but it also could be, in the case of some of these microfinance institutions, a loan gets made only if you have a group that has these activities that make it more likely that you'll pay back.
And I was trying to think what was the closest thing that I could think of like this, and frankly, it's Alcoholics Anonymous.
Interesting, yeah.
It's like an AA meeting. So what it means to me is there's actually a simple solution, and older alcoholics, if you ask them, will say, well, what's the solution? And the answer is don't drink.
Yeah, seems somewhat easy.
That's not that easy.
Yeah.
And so you have meetings, and you encourage each other, and you have people that you can call if you're having trouble. And you have a set of steps that you go through.
And you have public shame and embarrassment to help restrain you from your own short-run interests that might conflict with your long-run interests.
Yep. Well, the big problem, and what's interesting about this, there's a guy at George Mason that you may know. I think his name is like Tyrone Cohen.
Could you be referring to Tyler Cowen?
Oh, Tyler, yeah. So you know him.
Yeah, no, he's a colleague of mine. I think he's got a blog.
Yeah.
Marginal Revolution, for those of you.
One of the things that makes me mad about Tyler is that almost everything that I think of that's pretty cool, he thought of and already published 5 years ago.
Yeah.
So he had an article with Carol Boudreaux in Wilson Quarterly in 2008.
Yeah.
Where he actually kind of went against the tide. At that time, it was very important for everyone to say how wonderful microfinance was. And Tyler Cowen and Carol Boudreaux said two things. First, you're mistaken. This is not that wonderful. Its effects are pretty small. And second, the most important effect is not loans, it's saving. You should think of microcredit organizations really as a way of helping people save when otherwise they couldn't. And now, 3 years later, that's actually the conventional wisdom.
So let's start with the conventional wisdom that they were attacking. So there was a lot of hoopla and excitement about microfinance as a solution to poverty. And let me give you the version that I absorbed. I'm not an expert on it, but the part that sort of drifts through the atmosphere goes something like this. Poor people are credit constrained. They don't have access to capital. Hernando de Soto has argued that the resources that they don't have title to them often, like their house, such as their house, so they can't use them as collateral. So as a result, they have to live in the moment. And if we could only get them poor people access to capital, they could borrow and invest in the things that they could use that would allow them to escape poverty. They could buy small amounts of equipment to start a small business. They could get advanced access to credit that would allow them to make the payments they need to start that small business. So one claim, which has a certain appeal, is that the only thing holding back the poor people of the world is the fact that they can't borrow. And if we could only give them access to credit, which means if we could only give them some collateral that they could use with some kind of institution, they could escape. And as a result, there were a lot of organizations established to make these loans to poor people, so they could buy a small amount of equipment, which might be something as small as a sewing machine, which actually would be a pretty big investment, but small pieces of equipment, a cart, things that would allow people to carry things, a bicycle, a cell phone, that these would be the ways that poor people would escape poverty. So
maybe a soldering iron.
A soldering iron. So that was the hope that a very tiny step could have a very big payoff in getting rid of poverty. And you're suggesting that is not the case.
It just turns out that it's not the case. There's no evidence that it has any effect on levels of poverty, either of communities or individuals. It doesn't help.
Which is not to deny that entrepreneurship and starting businesses is good for the poor if they can do it and do it productively. And so it either suggests that those things are happening anyway or their impact would not be very large.
And the way that people have done this, people have done a lot of empirical studies. They've done controlled studies where they gave some people in the community access to grants for what essentially was microcredit, and others they did not, and then compared them after 2 years. And clearly there was, in some ways, if you give people money, it helps a little bit. They can buy stuff. But the idea that they would invest and start up this chain that would then allow them to become entrepreneurs is just mistaken. So there's quite a bit of controlled experiments in Africa and India that say that's not actually what's happening. But on the other side, there is an optimism. It turns out that although the story of we loan it to the people and they become successful and they lift themselves and maybe some of the people around them out of poverty, that turns out not to be true. But there is actually a very important positive effect that microfinance and microcredit has, and that is it helps people to save. The problem is not that they're credit constrained. The problem is they're savings constrained.
So explain what you mean by that.
Tyler Cowen actually comes up with an estimate for some people in central Mexico about what's the implicit rate of return on savings. And he gets negative 75%. That is, if I save $1, then it's understood that I have that in the form of cash. People will expect me to pay more for village festivals and rituals. They'll come to borrow it, not pay it back, and I'll be obliged to pay because these are familiar relationships. Maybe if I'm a woman and I've saved it, my husband finds some of it and drinks it up. So in order to save any large amount of money, I have to save almost 4 times that much because the rate of return on saving is actually negative. There was a study in India that said microfinance savings groups, the rate of saving that I'm actually acting on has about a negative 30% rate of return. That is, I'd be better off saving $100 and burning 30 rather than entering into one of these microfinance groups. So far from having a positive rate of return, they actually have a negative rate of return. The thing is that without this intervention, it would be even worse. It might be minus 80%. So we're allowing people to save at the price is less. In other words, we're reducing the price of saving. We're making it possible. And that seems incredible, literally incredible, unbelievable to those of us that are used to thinking, well, you just save. It turns out that's not true. And there's a number of anthropological studies that explain why that's so difficult.
Well, Tyler's reference to, Mexican village where certain implicit taxes imposed, what you might call social costs of being part of the community. I'm skeptical of that. It's hard to understand why such a dysfunctional practice, which mires a group of people in poverty, would persist. Those cultural norms, they sound very destructive. Obviously, there's a possibility they could produce something else that was of such great value that they could persist. But I want to step back a bit because I'm a little confused. The normal argument, and this is borne out also by evidence, and of course one of the problems with this whole field is that, when we talk about evidence, I'm putting it in scare quotes, it often means, I'm talking about this kind of microfinance or this kind of poor community or this kind of village. So it's a little bit dangerous to generalize. But what some people have claimed is that there are very high positive rates of return, that people take out these loans and pay a very high rate of pay a very high rate of interest, and it's still worth it, not just because it's to prevent the destruction and kind of wastefulness that you're talking about, but because there is a lot that can be done, and there's just high transactions costs to serve that market. And so not much of it does get done, and when it does get done, it gets done at high costs.
I think the answer has two parts. One is, if you think of this as a lottery, and it really makes a difference that 1 in 10 of the people who take out one of these loans actually does escape to the middle class, then that is a good thing. It's not very likely, but it is possible that some people actually create a small business. The problem is it's not 1 in 10, it's more like 1 in 100. So we are getting closer to lottery odds. And it has no effect on communities or nations. So there's not a way out of poverty. One of the things that I think, when you say step back, I think you're right. Why is poverty so persistent? It doesn't make any sense. If all this were credit constrained, then all that would be necessary is someone say, I see the problem. I'll be able to save money because it's easy, and I'll be able to invest at a 20 or 30% rate of return because we're credit constrained. There's this thing that will solve our problem, and that's called saving. So if it were as easy as providing credit, somebody would do it and make profits in just the way that you suggest. And that's proof that it's not credit constrained.
Well, some people claim that is happening. I just want to mention this because I think it's important. That we may not dwell on it, but I think it's important. There are people who make a living lending money to poor people at very high rates of interest. That happens in the United States with check cashing services and money stores of various kinds. And it happens in poor countries with banks that charge high rates of interest over short periods of time to people who borrow. And there's a backlash against that from all kinds of sources, some of it well-intentioned, some of it self-interested, from others who want access to those folks for different reasons. But the well-intentioned version of it is it's wrong to exploit poor people and charge them high rates of interest. Therefore, the expansion of credit to poor people around the world should be a charitable activity. It should be done by nonprofits. It shouldn't be done by financial intermediaries who are motivated by profit. It should be done as a charitable activity. And I think that is a very powerful and often held argument that is used in the policy debate on this.
Yeah, sure. No, I don't disagree with that at all. And it is interesting that it depends what you're thinking of as a unit of analysis. There have been, since time immemorial, people in every society that make money by lending money. And there's a certain set of norms that have been built up. They charge very high rates of interest. It's implausible that you could earn enough to be able to pay somebody back 100% per year or 200% per year. That investment opportunities are being passed up that have a return of 200% per year, which is what you would have to do to pay back the local money lender. Well, what microfinance tries to do, let's actually talk about the structure of one of these microfinance arrangements.
Okay.
There are many different ones, but the most common and the one that's used by Grameen Bank and a lot of the ones that are the darlings of the media and Hollywood work something like this. There's a group of us, maybe a circle, 7 or 8, and we decide that this is your month to get a loan. And so we'll give you $40. You make an immediate payment back to us of $4, 10% of the total. And every week for the next 9 weeks, 10 weeks, you pay back another $4. And at the end of the time, you've paid back $44. The original $40 plus 4% interest. If you add that up over
plus
the course
$4 of interest.
$4 of interest, right, which is something like 20 or 24%. Now,
that seems like a pretty expensive way to get access to $40 right now.
But it's way better than I could get it from a money lender. That's the model. That's what Grameen Bank actually does. And then the next person takes it. And since there's maybe 6 or 7 of us, I get to do 2 of this a year. In some cases, we may have an arrangement where I get to do it every month. Now, that's a pretty small amount of money. And I have to start paying it back right away. So it's not that I can invest and wait. Now, there are many people, not a high proportion, but many numerically, that actually work on something much more like a commercial loan, where I'll borrow $200 and agree to pay it back in a year after I have earned something according to the business plan. Maybe it's just I bought a soldering iron, I have a tin roof shack, and I'm going to build motherboards. I'm going to assemble inexpensive motherboards with this soldering iron because I'm good at that sort of small work. Those often work and pay a high rate of return. So if you screen for those guys can make 15 or 20% per year after repaying the loan. So there's numerically a fair number of those. If they can just get access to some kind of credit and initial capital, that's profitable commercially. Commercial banks make those kinds of loans in India and Africa. So that's not really what I'm talking about when I talk about microfinance. So we're sort of hiving off the part that we agree private enterprise can probably solve, maybe with a little bit of an initial push, maybe with some help on enforcing laws and contracts. There's some things about the culture that make it difficult, but at least in principle it's possible because there's money on the table there. It makes no sense to leave money on the table. So,
the money on the table being the opportunity that this person is going to be able to take advantage of once they have the soldering iron, the productivity.
It's just imperfect capital markets. I can borrow against my future earnings and more than pay them back. That transaction should be observed in a market.
And it does, and it is.
And it is.
Although a slightly higher rate than you might expect in a more developed economy, but it happens.
Yes, it happens, and it happens more and more, and some of the attention that was at first given to microfinance lending, it turns out that borrowing $40, owing all of it back within 10 weeks, and paying it back $4 a week is not a very good way to do that. So those guys are not now using microfinance. They're moving to much more like a traditional commercial banking model where I borrow $200 and I pay it back at the end of the year plus interest. So
let's go back then to the circle. So there's seven or eight of us. My understanding is they're typically women, right?
Often they're women. They don't have to be. One of the particular goals of Grameen Bank was to make sure that women got loans because it was particularly difficult for them to get loans. So he thought they were the most underserved population.
He is Muhammad Yunus, who got a Nobel Prize.
So Mr. Yunus thought they were the most underserved population, and he thought it would have the biggest impact on the family because his claim was that women would spend a higher proportion of whatever earnings they got on food and education.
Could be
where
true.
Men might or might not.
Yeah, could be true.
Yeah, it's at least worth a bet, and it certainly is objectively true that women had a hard time getting these loans.
So what have we now learned about this kind of system where it's a strange system? I get $40, but right away I'm starting to pay it back, and at the end of the story I've paid out a lot in interest overall, percentage terms. Question is, what am I doing with the money? What's the thrill here? What's the benefit? Why do I want to be the next person this month? Why do I want it to be my turn?
The answer is, it turns out absolutely clear, and that it's saving. So if I want something, I save up and then buy it. This system, that's impossible. You can't save. That's either a lack of self-discipline of all sorts of kinds. I don't mean for the individual. It's just the problems with the family. And the documentation of this was persuasive that they're just having a terrible time saving.
Well, so let's just set this up because it seems puzzling. It seems easy. It's easy to save. In 10 weeks, if I just put $4 aside, I'll have $40, and I won't have paid that extra $4, which is a lot of money if you're poor. It's a huge amount of money.
Yeah.
So I just have to wait 10 weeks. That's not so bad.
And that's what you should do.
But there's something that stops me from doing that.
If you could do that, you wouldn't see microfinance.
That's the claim.
It's not actually loans. It's savings.
So explain why that's true again.
Well, people have a lot of trouble saving, and the part of the reason was the reasons that Tyler gave, that there were, when everyone's very poor, if it's known that I have a small amount, or if my husband finds out that I have a small amount, it's kind of free money. I don't have any obligation for it. So if I'm saving up for something, they say, well, you can wait. If, however, I have an obligation.
All right, that's the next question. Why would I pay back the $4 then? How do I do that?
Well, I pay back the either way, we're assuming I get $4 a week.
Right.
I pay it back because I have this obligation to my friends. It's like AA.
Right.
I work harder to do it. So the good part about microfinance was that it created a culturally appropriate mechanism for ensuring repayment. So signing a contract wouldn't have done anything. Otherwise, there'd be commercial loans. But what does matter is that these other people in my village, people that I depend on, that I've known for a long time, and with whom I would lose face because of shunning and lack of social status if it's known that I'm a deadbeat. Plus, I lose access to, I get kicked out of the circle. So it means I don't get to participate anymore. So there's both monetary and non-monetary reasons why it works. So what people call this now is saving down. Instead of saving up, I'm saving down. I get the $40, and I spend it on food, or on education, on clothing. I bump up the level of consumption and welfare of my family, and then I pay it off. And then, interestingly, I do it again. For a lot of these circles, they actually have outside money coming in from a charitable organization or a nonprofit. Everybody in the circle may borrow something every month and repay it. So it's just saving down. All they're doing is reversing what you and I think of as the normal pattern of things. You save up and then you spend. Well, they spend and then they save down. But having that obligation and having that mutual support network that makes it okay for me to say no to my husband or no to my neighbor, I have to have this $4 so that I can pay it off. This is third best. This is not first or second best as a way of saving. So what's interesting is that as people have come to realize this, they've actually stopped emphasizing the microfinance part of it and started working towards first best institutions that actually would facilitate savings directly. And so the Gates Foundation, for example, took $100 million that they had already pledged to microfinance and instead used it to subsidize the creation of local banks that would make saving easier. Banks that are actually secure, that are not fraudulent, and where I can put the savings beyond the reach of having it in my house means it may be stolen, it may be my neighbors come over and make me feel bad about it. It's possible now for me to keep it secret.
So the idea here would be something like direct deposit, automatic withdrawal from.
Well, but you're making it too complicated. It's just what you said before. I have $4 and I take it down to the bank every week. That's the best.
That's the best.
It's amazing that that's not possible.
Then I could actually have access to $43 instead of $30.
And that's why your skepticism is well-founded. It just turns out that they didn't have any other institution. What's hard for us to get our minds around is that there was no other way to save. And so they used this third best sort of institution because it was available.
So I assume there's also a very important role here of insurance that's taking place because of variability of income, right? Poor people in the parts of the world we're talking about aren't on an annual 12-month salary. They're doing odd jobs here and there, bringing in a certain amount of money, and sometimes they don't bring in any money. And they need that $40 to pay for food that month, that week, right?
So I think it's partly insurance, and the circle there plays two roles. One, I get a chance for the $40, but if I miss a payment, they'll say, okay, we'll get you next time. We'll make up for it. So there's pooling both over time where I'm smoothing my income. I get this $40, and some people emphasize this smoothing part of it. There's also a cross-sectional insurance, though, where the 6 or 7 people in our group, I may be able to loan you $4 because you loaned me $4 7 months ago, and there's an explicit kind of reciprocity where it's the entire group that's responsible for the loan, not any individual. So I think there's two aspects to the insurance of it, and those are really important. When you have nothing, having the prospect of that $40 makes a big difference. You can pay off some things, buy new shoes, buy the medicine that your daughter needs.
And you don't, again, the punchline but from before is that you don't have a rainy day fund that you've built up for those things in the past because money just disappears.
No, and it turns out that it just disappears for reasons that are complicated and differ by different cultures. But remember, we're selecting on those cultures where this was very difficult. And so one of the most interesting studies, I think, in terms of the kind of behavior that they were looking for was by a fellow from the World Bank named Jonathan Morduch, Morduch. And they wanted to know why it was that people behaved in this odd way.
Odd way being that they took loans out that cost them a lot of money and that they didn't get a lot of return from directly. The paradox that you pointed out, they want to save and yet they don't. And yet they can save enough to pay back these loans. How can that be right? So they wanted to try to explain that, but they were working from the premise that if it was just credit constrained, people would save enough to make the loans, and then you would see the normal sort of path. Their conjecture was that they weren't credit constrained, they were saving constrained. But how could that be? So what they did was they asked them a pretty innocuous question, the sort of thing that reminds me what my Duke colleague here, Dan Ariely, does to try to reveal paradoxes. But they weren't looking for a paradox, they were looking for an explanation. What they did was they would give a survey and said, which of the following two things would you want? 250 rupees, which I think is a few dollars, 250 rupees tomorrow, or 280 rupees 3 months from now. Which of those do you want? And if you say 250 rupees tomorrow, then you're pretty constrained. You're pretty concerned with the present over the future. Because you're willing to forego that nice chunk of change you'd get extra.
So then they asked 250 or 290, 250 or 300. The question was, at what point would you switch over and say, yes, that's enough to compensate me.
I'll wait.
I want the money, I want the interest, the money plus the interest, not just the immediate gratification. And then they said, all right, how about this? Which would you rather have 12 months from now? 250 rupees or 280 rupees? And then 250, 290, and they kept going up until they switched again. And what they were looking for was what appear to be contradictions. In both cases, I'm asking you 250 versus 280, and the difference is 3 months. So your discount rate should be constant. There's nothing that would say your discount rate should vary over time. Your discount rate is how you value the present over the future. So all of us value the present over the future. The question is, by how much?
Correct.
Well, it turns out that there are three categories of people. Then potentially there's four, but there's nobody in the fourth category. One of the categories is the one who says, I want the 250 both times. That's perfectly consistent. It means they have a very high discount rate. They discount the future. They want the money now. Fair enough.
Meaning 250 versus 280 in 3 months or 3 months, I think?
Well, let me say it again because it is complicated. The first time I say 250 versus 280, the 250 is tomorrow, and the 280 is 3 months from now. And I say 250. And then I say, all right, a year from now, 250, or 15 months from now, 280, and I say 250 again. So in both cases...
That is complicated. So yeah, a year from now, 250, a year from now, 15 months, 3 months extra wait, 280, which would you rather have? It's the same appreciation of the funds over the same period of time. It's just that the whole thing is shifted by a year.
Yep, and so the question is, the year from now versus 15 months from now is probably a better measure of my actual sense of the future. Whereas the prospect of getting it tomorrow may, if I'm desperate, may just I have to have it. So comparing a year to 15 months from now is a more realistic and useful comparison. It's just that it's not tainted by my immediate need for
urgency.
Money.
Okay, so some people say in both cases I want 250 now.
Yep, and that's perfectly sensible. That means that you value the present more than the future, and fair enough. And there's also quite a few people who take the 280 3 months from now or 15 months from now. So in both cases, they would rather wait and get the extra interest.
Okay.
Well, the first type of person is the sort of person that might benefit from borrowing commercial loans. I get the money now, maybe I can repay it back because I have immediate needs for it.
Right.
The second sort of person is the sort of person that might benefit from being able to deposit money to make commercial loans because they're the sort of person that would rather get the interest.
Right.
And so, in fact, banks are intermediaries between the first type of person and the second type of person.
Right. They're bringing them together.
the absence of banks means that there is money being left on the table because some people want to loan money and some people would like to borrow it. And we're seeing that being filled, that gap being filled by small-scale commercial enterprises already of the sort that you talked about. There are people who make money, and there's more and more of them, who are able to act as intermediaries and say, all right, you have a low discount rate, we'll take your deposit, we'll find somebody with a high discount rate, loan the money to them, and we'll all be better off. The interesting thing is all three of those people are better off. The middleman's better off, the person that wants to make the loan is better off, and the borrower is better off. And, there's some amount that's not repaid, but if this were the entire story, there'd be no place for microfinance. Microfinance uniquely occupies the third niche, and that's someone who, when I say today versus 3 months from now, takes the today, takes the smaller amount. But if I say $250 in a year or $280 in 15 months, they take the $280 in 15 months. So given a chance, they would rather wait. They would rather save. But they're desperate because right now they have no mechanism for saving. And so what was interesting was the researchers, Jonathan Morduck and his colleagues, went back and looked at the people who were successful in these microfinance circles. And an extremely disproportionate number of them were of that third type, people who had need for money immediately, but who wanted to save in the sense that they valued the future more than the present. The fourth type of person would be someone who was the opposite, someone who wanted to save now but spend in the future, and there basically aren't any of those people.
So when you hear these kind of studies, my question's always, one question, I usually have a few questions, but one of the questions you would ask, of course, is that, we just described this over a phone line. It's a little complicated.
Yeah.
Not only is it a little complicated, it's a kind of situation I've never confronted anything quite like. So you often wonder whether the responses are heartfelt versus just tossed off as a way to get the surveyor to leave me alone, right? Even a Duke undergrad could be perplexed by that choice.
Well, I'm simplifying it in a way that makes it sound more complicated, if that's possible. Because the actual way that they asked the questions was a lot more detailed. And what I asked you was, would you rather have 250 or 251? 250 or 252? And the point at which you chose was the point where we locked it in. So it's actually more continuous than that. Thomas Schelling, in his book, 1984 book, Choice and Consequence, talked about the conflict between the patient future self and the impatient present self. And there's actually been quite a bit of research that has been done on these surveys that you get pretty consistent findings. What I think makes this more credible is that if you were right, and it's a plausible conjecture that we're inferring too much from this survey. If you also ask questions, though, about do you borrow money, do you loan money, do you participate in microfinance of the Grameen Bank sort, it classifies type 1, type 2, and type 3 people with remarkable accuracy. So just fun. Knowing how they answer this survey also allows you to predict their finance behavior. Do they borrow money for small businesses? Do they loan money, or do they participate in microfinance? And if their answers were random, it would be random.
Right. So again, the interesting question here is that if this phenomenon is widespread, of this type 3 person, or the person who is willing to forego significant sums of money for the opportunity to postpone consumption, for the opportunity to get consumption today, but can't manage to do it by saving. It really says that the research question then is to look at the cultural, as an outsider again, not as a policymaker. The issue would be what's constraining people's ability to save? Is it family issues? Is it these cultural norms, or is it something else?
And what was interesting about it was that if you look for the premise of why Grameen Bank exists, a lot of that was that women have a really hard time getting access to money. And if you look at the reasons, it's the answers to the question that you just posed. all of the things that would explain why it's hard for women to borrow money also explain why it's hard for them to save.
Which are?
Well, family, community, the norm that if you have some money and it's not specific. The problem with saving is I'm thinking about spending this in the future, and maybe I have something I want to spend it on, but it's not a specific obligation. But my obligations to my husband, my obligation to my community are damaging. And you said before you thought that maybe you would propose a kind of institutional evolution test where we would expect these cultural institutions over time to disappear. Well, maybe, but it takes a long time. I'm a Doug North student, and one of the things I thought that was most interesting about North is there's no reason to assume institutions are efficient. Organizations are efficient, but institutions can be highly inefficient, even pathological. And so, again, we're selecting on those societies that in spite of all the economic opportunity in the world have failed to grow and prosper. It's not most, but it turns out to be a lot of people. So they have these cultural and personal norms that act against, that mitigate against the ability of people to move out of poverty, and that's why poverty is so persistent. Well, if all it took was Natalie Portman actually said, now that we have microfinance, all it takes is a mouse click and we can eradicate poverty.
If only it were so. Yeah. Of course, it does raise the question I mentioned earlier, which is you're presuming that the only goal here is to get out of poverty. There could be other benefits from these norms that are not obvious to us who do not live there. Well,
one of the big norms is insurance. That it's understood that the community takes care of people who need. We have this obligation to take care of people who are in need. But that's part of the reason that it's so hard to save. If I have something and I have no specific obligation, that is, I'm just trying to save. Now I have in mind something I want to buy. But I have money and you don't, I'm obliged to provide it. And what that means is that it's all the insurance benefits that we've been talking about. So it's both a benefit and a curse. In the absence of other kinds of access to savings, rainy day fund, or actual insurance, we have to insure each other. And there's this deeply felt obligation in such societies for people in your village or people in your family to share. I don't actually have property rights to my own savings. I don't mean formally, I mean informally.
Yeah. Now, it reminds me of what we might think of as private rent-seeking. So you win the lottery.
Yeah.
And now you have a lot of friends.
That's perfect.
You have a lot of cousins that you didn't know about. Suddenly are so happy to see you.
Yeah.
So, this would explain, I guess, one argument perhaps that's analogous. I'll make it and let you comment on it. Is the athlete who signs the multi-million-dollar bonus, knowing that his career is not going to be infinite. He's probably going to have anywhere from 1 to 10 good years. 10 would be very unlikely. He might have this one big payday and often no success beyond it, particularly in basketball where people are now signing these contracts after 1 year of college and very uncertain as to what their real prospects are. But you have a lot of money and you'd think you'd be set for life because you're going to make your lifetime income stream is dramatically higher than the people you grew up with.
And yet a lot of them end up bankrupt. How could they be so stupid?
Right. That's the question.
Well, they're not. No. They actually and in some cases, they come from strata of society, socioeconomic strata of society, that are poverty is pretty common, and there are that sort of obligation. You have to keep it real. You have
buy
to
your mom a house. You buy your dad a car. You buy your friend from high school a car.
Yeah.
But that's a lot of fun. I don't want to. By the way, I don't want to minimize that as just a tax on you.
And the impulse is perfectly praiseworthy. But if your analogy, I think, is a good one. Certainly, if I became wealthy, it would be understood in India that I would be obliged to take care of my family.
Yeah.
But even at the margin, even if I have some savings, it means that I've been successful at something. And yes, they're willing to credit me. They'd be grateful when I help. But I would be acting wrongly if I deny them because I say I want to buy my daughter a dress or I want to send my daughter to school. So Tyler Cowen, again, I wish I liked him. Tyler Cowen, again, gives an explanation that it sort of captures it. Now, it's oversimplified, But suppose this is my week for the microfinance circle, and I get $40. Well, I go buy a cow. It's hard for my neighbor to come and get part of the cow.
Yeah, it's hard to take 10% of the cow.
So maybe they want some milk, but now I have some wealth that's indivisible. And this is a way, and I pay it back $4 at a time. But it'd be hard for me to save up because suppose I have $24 I've been saving for 6 weeks. Somebody says, well, do you have any money? No, I say. And then after a while I go and buy a cow. And you liar, you had money. How can you treat me that way?
Yeah, there's a lot of P.G. Woodhouse short stories, by the way, built on this. The premise of, Uckridge or somebody trying to get a $5 out of somebody who pretends not to have it. But I love the expression. It's the exact opposite social strata. It's the British upper class. The expression that P.G. Woodhouse always uses is to get in between his ribs. I guess that means to get a loan, to get £5 off him. Yeah. And I guess that's an expression of intimacy, right? Yeah. If you can get between somebody's ribs, you're pretty close to them.
Yeah.
And you're getting at it's also the equivalent of the storing it in your mattress or that's where you'd like to keep it at least.
Uh-huh. Well, partly because it's safe, but partly because it's disguised.
Yeah, that too. Yeah, that too.
So I actually think your analogy is one I haven't thought of, and it's right. It's just a lottery, but on a smaller scale.
Meaning?
The
winner of the lottery.
The winner of the lottery.
Right. Spare money generates rent seeking.
Yes, and you're obliged even more so in poor societies to share it because they probably have helped you in the past.
Yeah. Well, this view that it's not a magic cure for poverty, that microfinance is not a magic cure. I want to push back against that just a little because I do think some of the, in particularly poor places where property rights are ill-defined, collateral is non-existent, I think there is some entrepreneurial activity generated by microfinance. And the fact that it's not measurable at the aggregate level is may not be the best test.
It isn't the best test, and that's why they did random assignments of people in villages in India. Some were in the program and some not, and they looked at them after 2 years, those specific people, to test just that question. And the finding that there was zero difference, at least zero significant difference, I think is the most persuasive argument.
Yeah, that's distressing. I think the reason I mention it is I think there is William Easterly's written about this. I think very eloquently that there is a temptation to look for a giant, massive program to lift people out of a world where they're earning $1.50 a day to a world where they're earning $60 a day, and those aren't lying around.
Yeah,
and so modest, and I mean super modest, tiny improvements are therefore ignored that might be able to help people, and I think we have to be careful.
To be fair, microfinance is that. It probably does improve the quality of life of people in ways that are very hard to measure. So the study that I was talking about that had random assignment says, are women more credit constrained? Experimental evidence on gender and microenterprise return. And they did random assignment. What they found was that people who got this, instead of investing it, spent it on a little bit of education, some medicine, maybe a cow. There was no measurable difference in the rate of return that they were earning, but there was almost certainly a significant difference in the quality of life. And this was a very small amount of money. It was a total of maybe $200 or $300 per family. If we could find a way to make it cheaper to save, that was the promise of microfinance, was the people who were selecting being included in microfinance is people who actually wanted to save but were in such an institutionally Spartan environment that they couldn't manage to do it. That should be something that we can fix. I actually think that's hopeful. So I take your point. I do think, and in fact, the title of of Boudreaux and Cowan's article was "The Micro Magic of Microcredit," and it's somewhat ironic because it's not the magic bullet that some people believe in. But their conclusion, and I think it's right, there's much more promise than we have been giving credit to, if you'll forgive me, for saving. If we can just find a way to help people save, since they want to, then that's an easy problem to fix, actually.
Well, I'm not so sure. Why is that easy?
We need banks. All we need is banks.
Right, but I'm on my way to the bank with my $4, and there's there's Uckridge trying to get between my ribs to take
but
three of it from.
It's only $4, and I may be able to hide it.
I think that's the key, right?
Yeah.
The key is the part of this is just a little bit disturbing. It's my University of Chicago sensibilities. It's a little strange that in this story, the ideal bank would be open only for a minute or two, and once you deposited the money, you couldn't get it back for a long time, right? You wouldn't be able to withdraw it easily. Right, the higher the cost, the better. Because when the neighbor comes and says, "I need to buy a drink," you say, "Well, I don't have any money, but didn't I see you go to the bank?" "Yeah, I did." "Well, then let's go to the bank. Go get a couple. I don't need all of your $36 you've saved so far. Just need $7."
Yep.
And you say, "Well, the bank's closed. It's Tuesday." Right. So in this story, they want the bank closed most of the time, with all kinds of draconian, anti-consumer regulations that make it hard to get the money out. Right. It's a little bit disturbing. It
is disturbing. It's because you Chicago people believe institutions are efficient, or that there's a tendency.
Don't slander me, Munger. Don't call me one of those Chicago people.
You believe.
I said it was my roots.
Believe that there's a tendency for institutions to evolve towards more efficiency.
Yeah, I do. I do feel that, and I think of that not just as I'm going to just defend myself, not only as a Chicagoan thing, but a Hayekian thing. Right? Hayek was very. Argued often that institutions evolved over time to produce outcomes that were no one's intention. And the fact that this is so awful in the story that we're telling makes me wonder, is there some benefit that's out there that we're not seeing? Is it really like this all the time? So
I'm on that score, I prefer Hume to Hayek. There's a bunch of different ways of arranging societies, and once you have conventions, we accept them and we don't argue with them. Now, it's going to turn out that some are better than others. But what's lacking in institutional evolution is the mergers and acquisitions that we see in economics, or the nature red in tooth and claw that we see in biology. There's no natural selection process. There is mutation. There's all sorts of ways that we get different institutional forms. But there aren't the same pressures that mean that better institutions are going to take over from worse institutions, except in the very long run. Now, I do think we've moved much more towards market societies. And it happens that I believe that that's the most efficient and best institution for people who are poor, because it creates both wealth and consumer sovereignty. So I think we are moving in that direction, but it's very sticky.
I'll accept that. So do you know anything about what's going on with efforts to create these banks that might make it easier for people to save?
A number of them have been built. Some of them have failed. It turns out that since the rate of return is negative on saving, that people will actually save if you offer a zero rate of return. So that's a positive. I do think there's some of the problem where I'm going to the bank and somebody sees me and says, maybe they've heard that I go to the bank a lot. Are you saving money? Do you have any? Rather than I'm obliged to pay this back. So saving down may still be a better answer. I owe this money, I have to pay it. No, we can't go drinking. Rather than, no, I'm going to go put it in the bank. And the loans from these banks, the rate of interest that they have to pay, even though they're paying zero on deposits, the rate of interest that they have to charge because of the chances of default or non-payment, or at least missing payments, are pretty high. And so it's difficult to be able to know who can make, to the extent they're investing in commercial loans, there's just not enough profitable investment. And the big problem is, it's a circular argument, I realize, but the reason that loans are not profitable is there's not enough saving, because saving is investment. There's not enough capital in these societies to raise wages to the point where it's actually profitable to invest. So somehow we have to break through that. So I think in the short term, the money that's been spent by the Gates Foundation so far has had no impact. It's had no measurable impact. I was actually hoping.
Well, that's shocking, isn't it?
Well, remember the
depressing.
same story, we agree, happens with microfinance. There's no measurable impact. It doesn't mean it's not making people better off, but there's no aggregate measurable impact. And I accept your criticism about that. It means that it's hard to measure.
Yeah, fair enough. It really, though, I think, given that the commercial aspect of it is being served, albeit at a relatively high rate of interest, what this really is about seems to me, is smoothing, and a form of insurance. It does make life better, but it doesn't get at the real problem of how do we raise the productivity and alternatives that people in many countries face that are so miserable. So,
a big part of the answer is education for women, and there's just so many cultural obstacles to that.
I wonder if there are places where those obstacles have been overcome. There are, obviously, the United States being one of them.
We call those countries rich countries.
Yeah, it's true. You really think that's a barrier?
Sure. Yes, I think
it's a barrier.
I think it's an important barrier. I actually don't know if it's cause or effect.
Yeah.
It may be that once countries start to move into a situation where an educated woman's labor has a higher opportunity cost, it's no longer economically feasible for me to say I don't want women to be educated. You're paying too high a cost. Now, the economic benefit for an educated woman in a less developed society is not that big. It improves the quality of her life, perhaps, but the opportunity cost in terms of foregone labor is not that high because they have so little physical capital.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point.
So once you save, Adam Smith was just right about this. Once you start to save and accumulate and you have enough physical capital, that raises the marginal product and therefore the wage of labor, in particular skilled labor. It actually makes it inevitable the education of women and the more efficient use of labor resources.
I'm glad we found an intellectual antecedent that we can share. You Northian, you, but we're all Smithians. That's good.
Even you Chicago goofballs. You at least you use Smith for a doorstop.
My guest today has been Mike Munger. Mike, thank you for being part of EconTalk.
It was a pleasure.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.